Welcome to the Great Detectives of Old Time Radio from Boise, Idaho. This is your host, Adam Graham. If you have a comment, email it to me, box13 at greatdetectives.net. Follow us on Twitter at Radio Detectives and check us out on Instagram, instagram.com/Great Detectives. If you're enjoying the podcast, please follow us using your favorite podcast software. Also, I do encourage you, if you've not already, to check out my ebooks, All I Needed to Know I Learned from Columbo, and All I Needed to Know I Learned from Dragnet. Each examine the careers and histories of 7 great fictional detectives and policemen and life lessons that can be learned from them. They are available as audiobooks through audible.com or through the Apple Store, and they are also available wherever fine ebooks are sold. Well, now it is time for this week's episode of Mr. Chameleon. The original air date, September 7th, 1949, and this one is The Case of the Snarling Corpse.
Next, Mr. Chameleon and The Case of the Snarling Corpse. Tonight, we again present the famous Mr. Chameleon of Central Police Headquarters in his famous cases of crime and murder, brought to you by the makers of genuine Bayer aspirin. Mr. Chameleon, as you know, is the famous and dreaded detective who frequently uses a disguise to track down a killer, a disguise which at all times is recognized by the audience. Tonight, we give you Mr. Chameleon in The Case of the Snarling Corpse. It is early morning at Central Police Headquarters, and Mr. Chameleon, the great detective, is walking down the corridor which leads to his office. And to his surprise, when he opens his office door, he finds the Commissioner of Police waiting for him.
Well, good morning, Commissioner. You waiting for me?
Yes, Chameleon. Something unexpected has come up. Something a little off the beaten track. You remember Dr. Harold Vinton, don't you?
Oh, I should say I do. He was great help in the Ardsley murder case. I have a lot of respect for Dr. Vinton.
Well, so have I. I've just had an urgent phone call from him. A man named Morton Renfrew, a patient of Dr. Vinton's, died during the night. And something about his death makes Dr. Vinton reluctant to issue a death certificate.
Oh.
Renfrew lived just outside the city. Dr. Vinton wants you to come out if possible.
Something strange about the man's death, huh? I wonder what. All right, I'll get right out there, Commissioner.
Good. Oh, and Chameleon, one more thing. Dr. Vinton said that a Chinese houseboy, Sing Lu, will admit you. And you're not under any circumstances to let him know you're connected with the police.
So, a little later, in a suburb a short distance from New York, we find Mr. Chameleon ringing the doorbell of a huge, old-fashioned house, obviously a home of wealth. And Chameleon smiles pleasantly as the door opens a crack and a Chinese servant peers out at him suspiciously.
Good morning. I'm a friend of Dr. Vinton.
Dr. Vinton, no see anyone.
But Dr. Vinton is expecting me.
Dr. Vinton, no see anyone.
I think he will. I'm sorry, I'm coming in. Dr. Vinton.
I'm in here, Mr. Chameleon, in the library at the right. What's the matter? Didn't Sing Lu want to let you in?
He most certainly did not. What is the trouble, Dr. Vinton?
Come here. I want you to look at the body of Morton Renfrew. Poor old Morton. He was my friend as well as my patient.
Oh.
Look at him. Look at his face, Mr. Chameleon.
Good Lord, Dr. Vinton. He looks as though he was snarling. His teeth are bared like an animal's. I've never seen anything like it.
No, it's not very pretty. But that snarl, Mr. Chameleon, is known as Rhizonis sardonicus. It's a sign that he had died of lockjaw.
Oh, well, did he die of lockjaw?
Oh, yes, there's no question of that.
Well, then what makes you think his death is a matter for the police?
Look here. See this nasty festering cut between the thumb and forefinger of Morton's hand?
Oh, yes.
Well, that was made yesterday by this rusty knife. He was sharpening pencils. Here are the pencils laid out on his desk.
Well, Dr. Vinton, I still don't see
Mr.
how...
Chameleon, a cut like that does not necessarily cause lockjaw. That's a fallacy. Most people believe it, but it's not true. Besides, Morton Renfrew had a great fear of knives. It was almost a phobia.
Are you sure of that, Dr. Vinton?
Positive, Mr. Chameleon. Morton cut himself badly in the leg when he was a boy.
Yet he was using a rusty knife to sharpen pencils, presumably. I'd like to open his desk. Yes, Doctor, look. Here is a pencil sharpener in the drawer. 2 of them. Yet Morton Renfrew was fooling with a rusty knife. When were you first called in?
Last night, Mr. Chameleon. When I came back this morning, Morton Renfrew was dead, less than 12 hours after he cut himself. Now, lockjaw seldom works that fast.
That is very interesting, too.
I can't understand it. The tetanus germs were already in Morton's spine, which is where they go in lockjaw cases, and they hadn't time to get there.
You mean from a simple cut on the hand? Well, suppose that someone had injected those germs into Morton Renfrew's body.
So far, I haven't found any mark of an injection anywhere on his body. Wait. Under his beard. Look, Mr. Chameleon. Right here, under the beard.
There's the mark. Someone did make some sort of an injection.
Yes, you're right. But where did they get the lockjaw germs?
This knife, Dr. Vinton, when I first saw it, it looked unusual. I recall now what it is. It's a kind of knife they use to pare horses' hooves. Are there horses on the place?
Yes. The Renfrews have quite a stable. Both Morton and his brother Louis are great horsemen.
That's it. Tetanus germs that cause lockjaw flourish in stables. Dr. Vinton, this is murder. I'm going to call Central Police Headquarters and have Detective Sergeant Dave Arnold sent up here to help me. Then I want you to give me a quick summing up of the people who lived here with the murdered man.
There's a phone there on the desk, Mr. Chameleon.
Thank you. Central Headquarters, this is Chameleon speaking. Please send Detective Sergeant Dave Arnold out to the Morton Renfrew home at once. Now, Dr. Vinton, what about the Renfrew household?
It's a small one, Mr. Chameleon. Morton Renfrew was nearly 50. His brother Louis is a little over 40. They're both retired and both bachelors.
You see?
They have a housekeeper, Mrs. Whipple.
And Sing Lu, the Chinese houseman who didn't want to let me in.
And Sing Lu. I've never liked or trusted that little man. I sent him up to fetch Louis Renfrew and Mrs. Whipple. And here comes Louis, charging like a rhinoceros.
Dr. Vinton, what is this? Sing Lu tells me that the police are here. What is this insanity?
It is not so insane, Mr. Renfrew. I am Chameleon of Central Police Headquarters. Your brother Morton was murdered.
Murdered? What nonsense. Morton died of lockjaw. Any doctor should know that, but Vinton's a fool. A meddling old fool.
Now, look here, Louis.
Take it easy, Dr. Vinton. Let me handle this thing. Do you mind waiting outside for Detective Sergeant Dave Arnold? Perhaps you can help with a police autopsy.
I'll be glad to, Mr. Chameleon. Call me if you need me.
Police autopsy? Mr. Chameleon, I won't have this. My brother died of lockjaw because he cut himself with a rusty knife.
But your brother Morton was terribly afraid of knives.
Oh, Morton got over that childish fear years ago. Mrs. Whipple will tell you. Oh, here she is right now. Mrs. Whipple, that fool of a Vinton sent for the police.
The police? Whatever for?
Well, I'll tell you what for, Mrs. Whipple. Murder. I'm Chameleon of Central Police Headquarters, and I want you to tell me the truth about what happened to Morton Renfrew.
But it's as plain as the nose on your face, isn't it? Mr. Morton died of lockjaw. He cut himself on that knife. A cut like that between the forefinger and the thumb always causes lockjaw.
Does it really?
I'm surprised a smart detective like you didn't know that, Mr. Chameleon.
Well, I'm learning all the time, Mrs. Whipple. All the time. Now, why was Morton Renfrew allowed to die of lockjaw? Why wasn't Dr. Vinton called in sooner?
He was. I called him in when Mr. Morton first cut himself.
And then there was an interval of quite a few hours when he got worse, very rapidly.
Yes, but none of us realized it. Morton thought he was all right. And Dr. Vinton's a very busy man. I hated to keep bothering him.
So you let your brother die?
I didn't let him die.
He died from lockjaw, from that cut on his hand. A cut like that is always fatal.
So you've already told me, Mrs. Whipple. Where is Sing Lu, the houseman, Mr. Renfrew? I'd like to talk to him.
Eavesdropping, no doubt he usually is. Oh, yes, he's right by the door. Come in, Sing Lu. Mr. Chameleon wants to talk to you.
No. No.
Sing Lu, your master Morton Renfrew has been murdered. You must talk to me. Then you must tell me the truth.
No, not with them. Not with them.
Do you mean that you won't talk in front of Mrs. Whipple and Louis Renfrew?
That's ridiculous.
I think not, Mr. Renfrew. All right, Sing-Lu, we'll step outside.
What Sing-Lu has to say, he can say in front of us.
Let me remind you, Mr. Renfrew, that I am handling this case. Come along, Sing-Lu. All right, Sing-Lu, they can't hear you. What do you have to tell me? Did Louis Renfrew quarrel with his dead brother, Morton Renfrew?
Oh, yes, all the time. Never used to, but now all the time.
What did they quarrel about, Sing-Lu?
Huh?
Mrs. Whipple?
Yes, Mrs. Whipple.
Why?
She make love both of them. She smart woman.
Do you mean both Louis and Morton Renfrew were in love with Mrs. Whipple, the housekeeper, and they quarreled about her?
Yes, yes. Mr. Morton, he say Mr. Louis cannot marry her. All the time they shout at each other.
I see. Well, Sing-Lu, I told you that I won't let anyone hurt you, so you needn't be afraid. Mr. Renfrew, Mrs. Whipple, Sing-Lu has just told me that you, Mrs. Whipple, made trouble between the brothers.
If he said that, he's a liar.
Why, the dirty little sneak. I'll kill anyone who says that about Helen.
Oh, so it's Helen now, is it, Mr. Renfrew? Are you in love with Mrs. Whipple?
Yes, he is. We're engaged to be married.
And my brother Morton approved of it, no matter what Sing-Lu says.
Suppose that he hadn't approved, Mr. Renfrew. Could he have stopped the marriage? He was the eldest brother, wasn't he? Did he hold the purse strings in the family?
Well,
I can easily find out, you know, Mr. Renfrew.
yes, Morton did control the estate. But Sing-Lu had a better reason for killing my brother than I did.
He liar. He wicked man. He lie, Mr. Chameleon.
Well, that seems to be your favorite term for each other. Answer that doorbell, Sing-Lu, and let me know who it is. Well, answer it.
Yes, sir. But he wicked man.
Oh, that wretched little creature. He should have been fired long ago. I told Mr. Morton he should have been fired.
Why, Mrs. Whipple?
Because he was stealing from my brother Morton, Mr. Chameleon. Only small sums, but he was definitely stealing.
Mr. Morton even threatened Sing-Lu with the police.
So you believe that it's quite possible that Sing-Lu murdered Morton Renfrew?
Yes.
Well, Mrs. Whipple, you're contradicting yourself. You've been shouting that Morton Renfrew died from lockjaw because he cut himself on that knife.
Well, I still think that's true. Everyone knows a cut like that causes lockjaw.
Mr. Chameleon.
Yes, Sing-Lu, I'll be right there. And, Mrs. Whipple, let me say that repetition can sometimes be dangerous. You are determined to make me think that a cut like that is always fatal. Well, I happen to know differently. So, stop working at it so hard. Who's at the door, Sing-Lu?
Miss Ethel and Clark.
Who are they?
I mean, Mr. Bailey, Mrs. Bailey. He young nephew.
Oh, I see. Morton Renfrew's nephew and his wife. Sing-Lu, did anyone enter this house while Mr. Morton was ill, beside Dr. Vinton?
No, sir, no.
All right. That the young couple there?
Yes, sir.
Mr. Bailey, I'm Chameleon of Central Police Headquarters. I understand that you're the nephew of Morton Renfrew.
Why, yes, Mr. Chameleon. And I've heard of you, of course.
Sing-Lu said the police were here.
Yes, Mrs. Bailey. Morton Renfrew is dead.
Dead? Oh, Clark! Clark, we're too late.
Oh, Ethel, darling. Mr. Chameleon, this is horrible.
What do you mean? And why do you say that you're too late?
We got this letter just this morning, Mr. Chameleon. We hadn't seen Uncle Morton in weeks.
He turned to us for help, and we got here too late.
Let me see the letter, Mr. Bailey. My house has become a place of horror. I cannot sleep nights. I live in constant fear. If I should die unexpectedly, look for murder, for I am sure I shall be killed in some peculiarly horrible way. Signed, Morton Renfrew.
How did he die, Mr. Chameleon?
As he prophesied he would, in a peculiarly horrible and diabolical way.
Mr. Chameleon and the case of the Snarling corpse continues in just a moment. When you have an ordinary headache, fast relief is important. But even more important is gentle, dependable relief. And that's why it'll pay you to always use genuine Bayer aspirin. For Bayer aspirin is one thing you can take with complete confidence. No other pain reliever can match Bayer aspirin's record of use by millions of normal people without ill effect. Yes, for the two most important kinds of relief, always use genuine Bayer aspirin. Because it's actually ready to go to work in 2 seconds, it will bring you the fast relief you want. And because it's reliable, you can take it sure in the knowledge that it'll bring you the gentle relief that's important to your health. So whenever you're in pain, don't experiment with drugs that have not stood the test of time. Instead, use something that millions know from experience is completely dependable, genuine Bayer aspirin. When you buy, ask for it by its full name, Bayer aspirin, not just for aspirin alone. Get the 100-tablet bottle, and you get Bayer aspirin tablets for less than a penny apiece. And now, back to Mr. Chameleon and the case of the Snarling corpse. Morton Renfrew has died of lockjaw, and Mr. Chameleon is convinced the tetanus germs were deliberately injected into his body. And now in the Renfrew home, Mr. Chameleon has just finished reading a letter which Morton Renfrew's nephew and his wife have shown him. And he says to Clark Bailey, the young nephew,
Mr. Bailey, this letter is shocking. Your Uncle Morton Renfrew evidently was quite aware that someone wanted to murder him.
I know, Mr. Chameleon. That's what's so horrible. Poor Uncle Morton, he was surrounded by enemies. Evidently, he trusted only my wife, Ethel, and me.
Well, Mr. Bailey, why didn't you come to his aid sooner? This letter is postmarked 3 weeks ago.
But we only got it this morning. We've been away in the country.
Our apartment was closed, Mr. Chameleon.
We just came in to get our mail.
And the letter is typewritten, so there may be a carbon copy of it somewhere here in the Renfrew home.
There should be, yes. We thought of that, too.
Come along. I want to show it to Louis Renfrew. And Mrs. Whipple.
That horrible housekeeper.
Why horrible, Mr. Bailey?
Because she did her best to try to marry Uncle Morton. Then when he wouldn't fall for her, she went after Uncle Louis.
Ah, yes. Charming creature. Mr. Renfrew?
Yes, Mr. Chameleon? Well, and here's Ethel and Clark. It didn't take you long to get here to collect your inheritance, did it?
Don't talk like that, Uncle Louis. That's not why we're here.
No, they're here, Mr. Renfrew, because your dead brother wrote them a letter saying that he fully expected to be murdered.
What? Let me see that. This letter is a fake.
Of course it's a fake. The Baileys wrote it themselves.
Oh, did they really, Mrs. Whipple? Well, we'll try to find out. You have a safe here, Mr. Renfrew?
A safe? Why, yes, behind the tapestry.
Open it, please.
What for, Mr. Chameleon?
I said open it, please. I presume you know the combination.
Naturally, my brother Morton and I were the only ones who knew it.
Well, then open the safe and look through it, Mr. Renfrew. Let's see if your brother kept a carbon copy of this letter.
Very well, but it's ridiculous.
It's an outrage, too. Morton wasn't murdered. He died of lockjaw from that cut on his hand.
Mrs. Whipple, if you say that once again, I will be convinced that it was you who made that cut to cover up the murder. Well, Mr. Renfrew?
There's no letter in this safe.
You sure? Look carefully. If you conceal anything, I warn you, it'll go hard with you.
Here's something, Mr. Chameleon.
Let me see it. Yes, this is it. To whom it may concern, I live in fear of my life. This is a house of horror, etc. So you see, Mr. Renfrew, the letter was not faked. Your brother expected to be murdered, and he was, hideously.
But later, at Central Police Headquarters, we find Mr. Chameleon pacing his office restlessly, and with him is Detective Sergeant Dave Arnold. And Chameleon is saying,
I tell you, Dave, this case is getting me down in a big way. The motives are all there. So is the evidence of murder. Yet I can't arrest anyone. Can't seem to get the break that I need.
That's quite an autopsy report, Mr. Chameleon.
Ah, yes, it is. I wish Dr. Vinton would phone. Chameleon speaking.
Mr. Chameleon, this is Dr. Vinton.
Oh, Dr. Vinton. Detective Sergeant Arnold just gave me the completed autopsy report. Did you know that Morton Renfrew was doped before he died?
Good heavens, no. When I first called in to see him to treat the cut, I thought he seemed drowsy, but he'd been taking some sleeping pills lately, so naturally I didn't suspect he was doped.
Well, he was. It really took effect after you left, and before you returned and found him dead.
Poor Morton. Then he was helpless when someone injected the tetanus germs into him. But who in that household had a hypodermic needle?
That is the number one question, Dr. Vinton. I have a motto, you know. The innocent must be protected. The guilty must be punished. And I have never had a case where I was more anxious to see the guilty punished.
Well, if there's anything more I can do, Mr. Chameleon...
Yes, well, I'll let you know, Doctor. Thank you.
Mr. Chameleon, didn't Dr. Vinton realize Morton Renfrew was doped before he was murdered?
No. Dave, there is something here that smells to high heaven. And we have only one little lead, one very peculiar angle, which may or may not betray the killer. Anyway, let's go.
Where to, Mr. Chameleon?
I want to pay a call on Clark and Ethel Bailey.
What for?
Well, among other things, to ask them about Sing Lu, the Chinese servant.
Oh, how do you do, Mr. Chameleon?
Good afternoon, Mrs. Bailey. This is Detective Sergeant Dave Arnold. Do you mind if we come in?
Oh, not at all. Clark, it's Mr. Chameleon.
Well, hello there, Mr. Chameleon. How's everything going?
So, Mr. Bailey. This is Detective Sergeant Dave Arnold.
How do you do, sir?
It's a very attractive place that you have here.
Well, it's comfortable. Have you discovered any clues to my Uncle Morton's murder?
Not very many, Mr. Bailey. I wanted to ask you about Sing Lu.
What about him?
First, I understand the two of you inherited quite a lot of money from Morton Renfrew.
Oh, I suppose Uncle Lewis told you that, Mr. Chameleon. We inherited a third of Uncle Morton's estate. Uncle Lewis, of course, gets the other two-thirds.
But what do you want to know about Sing Lu?
Did Mrs. Whipple, the housekeeper, get anything under the will?
I doubt it, Mr. Chameleon, but if she marries Uncle Lewis, she's fixed for life.
What about Sing Lu, Mr. Chameleon?
What? Oh, yes, Sing Lu, the Chinese servant. How long did he work for Morton Renfrew?
About a year, and Uncle Morton always distrusted him.
And so did Dr. Vinton. So did Dr. Vinton.
Well, what else do you want to know about Sing Lu?
Well, that's all, Mrs. Bailey. Dave, come along.
You mean you're leaving already, Mr. Chameleon? I can't say that we've been of much help.
Yes, you have, Mr. Bailey, and you can help me still more. You'll be at the Renfrew house at 9 o'clock tonight.
But, Mr. Chameleon...
Well, you're not afraid of Louis Renfrew? Or Mrs. Whipple, are you, Mrs. Bailey? Or Sing Lu?
Even if we were, we'd still be there, Mr. Chameleon.
Good boy. See you at the Renfrew home at 9 o'clock sharp.
Do you really expect to have a showdown tonight, Mr. Chameleon?
Yes, I do, Dave. I think by then we'll be ready for a showdown. Though I have a little footwork for you to do this afternoon. Oh, Dave, when we assemble at the Renfrew house tonight, I shall be there in disguise. Not as Chameleon the detective, but as Ira Miller, an expert on handwriting and typewriters.
And that evening at 9 o'clock, we find Mr. Chameleon in the drawing room of the Renfrew house with Detective Sergeant Dave Arnold. And Dave is looking at Mr. Chameleon with admiration and saying to him,
By gosh, that's some disguise, Mr. Chameleon. Where'd you get that baggy suit and the walrus mustache? You look 10 years older.
Well, thank you, Dave. Here comes Dr. Vinton. Let's try the disguise on him. Introduce me as Ira Miller, and I'll speak in Miller's voice.
Okay. Hello, Dr. Vinton. I'd like you to meet Ira Miller. Mr. Miller, Dr. Vinton.
How do you do, Dr. Vinton?
How do you do, Mr. Miller? But where's Mr. Chameleon? He'll join us later, Dr. Vinton. Is everyone here?
Everyone. Mrs. Whipple, the young Baileys, and Louis Renfrew.
And Sing Lu. Is he here?
Oh, yes. Why such emphasis on Sing Lu?
You'll soon see, Dr. Vinton. Coming, Mr. Miller?
Right behind you, Detective Sergeant Arnold. Well, you present me to everyone. Tell them why I'm here.
Of course, Mr. Miller. That's why we're here. Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for being so prompt, especially you, Mr. and Mrs. Bailey.
We said we wouldn't fail you, Detective Sergeant Arnold. But where's Mr. Chameleon?
He'll be along soon. But first, I want you to meet Ira Miller, who's often worked with the police. He's an expert on handwriting and typewriters.
What the devil does that have to do with my brother's death?
Plenty, Mr. Renfrew. Tell him, Mr. Miller.
I have here a letter which the late Morton Renfrew wrote, claiming that he expected to be murdered in this house.
Is that the letter that Uncle Morton sent to my husband Clark and me?
Mrs. Bailey, it's the same letter. And here's the envelope that it was sent in. There's something very odd here. The letter was typed on Morton's typewriter. There's no question about that. But the envelope wasn't. Envelope, which is addressed to Mr. Clark Bailey, was typed on a small machine, on a Hemingway Portable, to be exact. Now, does anyone in this room own a Hemingway Portable typewriter? No? No one here owns a Hemingway Portable? Well, afraid the police can't take your word for it.
What do you mean?
Well, I mean, Mr. Bailey, that Detective Sergeant Arnold is going to search your apartment.
Oh, no, he's not. I won't let him search my apartment.
You can't do that. You have no right to.
Why not, Mrs. Bailey? Because you know perfectly well that you have a Hemingway Portable.
Mr. Chameleon. You're Mr. Chameleon.
Yes, I pretended to be a typewriter expert to speed things up a little. I suspected the truth when I noticed that the typing on the envelope was different from that on the letter. In other words, Mr. Bailey, Morton Renfrew did not send you the letter. You sent the letter to yourself.
Why would we do that?
Quite simple, Mrs. Bailey. You wanted to divert suspicion from yourself. It was you and your husband that Morton Renfrew suspected and was afraid of. He showed you the letter, and you stole a copy and mailed it to yourself, addressing the envelope on your own typewriter.
No.
It was the letter that first aroused my suspicion. It did not say, "Dear Clark." It said, "To whom it may concern." It's a very odd beginning for a letter to a nephew.
That means nothing.
But you just denied that you had a Hemingway Portable typewriter, and I saw a Hemingway Portable when I visited your apartment. That beautiful apartment plus a country place is quite an expensive way of living for a young couple like you, Mr. Bailey. I'm sure that you needed your uncle's inheritance.
That still proves nothing, Mr. Chameleon.
But your interest in the servant Sing Lu proved something.
What?
I deliberately mentioned Sing Lu, Mrs. Bailey, to see how you'd react. And you reacted plenty, because Sing Lu was your accomplice.
No, I do nothing.
Is that why Clark Bailey paid you $1,000, Sing Lu, to do nothing? We found the check deposited to your account.
No, Mr. Clark, he lent me money.
Very generous of him. He also lent you a hypodermic needle filled with tetanus germs.
But how would he get those germs, Mr. Chameleon?
Very good question, Louis. Clark got the germs because he's a student in a special field of science relating to germs, bacteriology. Detective Sergeant Dave Arnold dug that up. So, Clark took the germs from the laboratory where he studies and gave them to Sing Lu, and Sing Lu injected them into the body of Morton Renfrew.
No, they do it. They put them in Mr. Morton. I only give Mr. Morton dope that puts him to sleep. Then later, they come when House was asleep. They come with needle and jab it on the beard.
Shut up! Shut up!
Take it easy, Clark Bailey. We've got you and your wife covered. And that does it. Sing Lu's evidence will convict you but good. You know, another thing that made me wonder from the very beginning was that you never asked exactly how your uncle was murdered. You didn't have to. You knew that it was done with a hypodermic needle because you did it yourself.
And with these words, Mr. Chameleon concludes tonight's murder case. It's only natural that when you have an ordinary headache, you want fast relief. And to find out how quickly Bayer aspirin is ready to go to work, all you need do is test it in a glass of water. What happens to a Bayer aspirin tablet in the glass also happens in your stomach. And the speed with which it disintegrates indicates the speed with which it's ready to go to work. When you make this test, you'll see that Bayer aspirin tablets start disintegrating almost instantly, are actually ready to go to work in 2 seconds. Hence, they provide remarkably fast relief. So when you need something to relieve pain, be sure of how quickly it will act. Be sure with Bayer aspirin. When you buy, ask for Bayer aspirin, not just for aspirin alone. Get the 100-tablet bottle, and you'll get Bayer aspirin tablets for less than a penny apiece. Listen next Wednesday night at the same time for Mr. Chameleon, the man of many faces, in The Murder Clue of the Embalmed Body. The part of Mr. Chameleon is played by Karl Swenson, with dialogue by Marie Baumer, from the original story by Frank and Ann Hummert. Music directed by Victor Arden. Your announcer is Warren Sweeney.
Important to everyone is the news of a remarkable scientific discovery which now makes it possible to cut down tooth decay and the pain, worry, and expense that go with it. What you do is use new ammoniated Dr. Lyon's tooth powder. Based on a formula developed by University of Illinois scientists, it cuts down tooth decay, actually helps prevent cavities. That's why so many dentists recommend this type dentifrice. So for sounder, healthier, handsomer teeth, use ammoniated Dr. Lyon's tooth powder. Both regular Dr. Lyon's tooth powder and new ammoniated Dr. Lyon's are at all drug and toilet goods counters.
Listen for Mr. Chameleon in The Murder Clue of the Embalmed Body next Wednesday night at this time. This is CBS, the Columbia Broadcasting System.
Welcome back. Well, once again, I have no idea how the disguise is supposedly supposed to speed things up. But other than that, I thought this was an interesting case. The idea of tetanus being used as part of a murder frame-up was something that was explored in one of my favorite Nero Wolfe short stories, Cordially Invited to Meet Death, which I highly recommend. Well, now we turn to listener comments and feedback, and we have quite a few regarding the vacation murder case, and we start out on Facebook with Emmett, who writes, "This was a real clunker, even for Mr. Chameleon. When the bereft husband learns of his wife's death, his grief is almost a parody. Acting like this is worthy of a Marx Brothers movie." And David reflects, "The detective encountering a murder on the vacation is a tried and true trope. But the setup to this is kind of odd. At first I thought it was weird that he would vacation at a luxury resort hotel that's within a short distance of New York City, and apparently within his jurisdiction, as he can just call Dave Arnold in to help him investigate. But on second listen, it sounds like he's just hanging out at the hotel for the day and not even staying there. Maybe this is a cultural thing, like clip-on earrings, and day tripping to hotels was a common thing in the 1950s. But it seems kind of weird to me." Well, thanks so much, David, and I don't think it was all that common for a really nice resort like that. But I wasn't there, and if anyone's got any insight as to whether that was at all plausible, I'd love to hear from you. And then we have some comments from YouTube, and Diana writes, "This is the first time I've heard a Mr. Chameleon radio play. Not bad, I'll look for more." And another listener writes, "I enjoy this show very much." Then we turn to an email I received from Ken, and Ken writes, regarding this episode, "Mr. Chameleon was a mixed bag this week. He let me down in one way, but came through like a champ in others. Usually, Mr. Chameleon gives his disguised character a complete backstory with first and last name. Who among us can forget Slick Fingers, the pickpocket, or Paddy Inebriated, the Irish racetrack tout? I may be misremembering their exact names. Regardless, Mr. Chameleon takes great pains to perfect his disguise, but this time, the best I could tell, he put on a loud shirt, did not bother with a backstory, and walked around in the rain until the nefarious nurse explained the caper to him and handed over the loot. Substandard effort from the great man. Mr. Chameleon giving himself a first and last name while in disguise is particularly interesting, since he does not seem to have a first name himself, unless his name is actually Mr. Chameleon. He did come through by taking a one-day vacation which he spent with his faithful factotum, Sergeant Dave Arnold, and it was a pleasure to hear his standard, excellent police work, browbeating the innocent mother-son grifters and the hard-luck hotel clerk. Well, Ken, I will say, in Mr. Chameleon's defense, he was on that one-day vacation, so that's about the best you can get when he's just not fully engaged. I'm just half working my way through this. And then I actually got another email from Ken. I listened to the vacation murder mystery again and realized I was remiss in pointing out another of Mr. Chameleon's excellent investigative techniques, namely browbeating the widower about his finances as a possible motive for murder. Then that whole inquiry was dropped without another word. Well, thanks for the comment, and you're actually the second person to mention re-listening to the episode, which is just kind of notable, as I've not heard from a whole lot of people who re-listen to episodes like close to the time that they're released. I'll hear from folks who several months or years later. And I do think that Mr. Chameleon is not the type of show that you're going to appreciate more on re-listening. There are some audio dramas where if you re-listen to them, you come away with a deeper understanding and realize there are hidden depths. And then there's Mr. Chameleon. And then we get a comment regarding the mistreated wife murder case. Mr. Chameleon was a champ this week, giving his burglar disguise a name. He probably should have signed his complete name to a search warrant, but what fun is that for Mr. Chameleon and Dave? Oh, Mr. Chameleon, don't go changing. Have a great vacation, Adam. See you on the other side. Well, thank you so much, Ken. I appreciate your comments. It was an interesting break. We got a few things done, and we went to a couple of places around Boise. My son wasn't feeling well for a couple of days, and that put a little bit of a damper on some of our plans. Plus, I think one thing I struggle with on vacations is I tend to overbook activities if I'm not careful. And I did set aside as I want to spend some good time just doing nothing, relaxing. But things came up, and that part of the vacation kind of went all out the window. But still had some good times and was able to spend some nice time with my wife and son and celebrate my anniversary. All right, well, now it is time to thank our Patreon supporter of the day. And I want to go ahead and thank Diane, Patreon supporter since July of 2023, currently supporting the podcast at the Detective Sergeant level of $7.14 or more per month. Thank you so much for your support, Diane, and that will actually do it for today. If you're enjoying the podcast, please follow us using your favorite podcast software. And if you're listening on YouTube, be sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and mark the notification bell. All those great things that help YouTube channels grow. We will be back next Thursday with another episode of Mr. Chameleon, but join us back here tomorrow for yours truly, Johnny Dollarware.
You ready to go to work?
Yes, sir, whenever you are.
Whenever I am. You're the one's getting paid to be a detective.
Well, I can't do my job without your cooperation, Mr. Gillis.
Well, what do you want me to do?
Just answer a couple of questions.
Just answer, but didn't that sweet pea of an agent tell you all you need to know?
Well, he couldn't. He didn't know anything except that a dog you have insured.
A dog? A dog, you say? Is that what you call her? Why, you miserable, cold-hearted... A dog.
Well, isn't that what you've lost, Mr. Gillis?
No! And don't you ever let me hear you calling that if she's a little lady. If you must refer to the type of being she is, well, she's a canine.
Okay. Do you mind telling me under what circumstances the canine disappeared?
I wouldn't mind at all. And please call her Ming Toy.
Beg your pardon?
Ming Toy, that's her name. Ming Toy Murphy. What's the matter, you dog?
I hope you'll be with us then. In the meantime, send your comments to box13@greatdetectives.net. Follow us on Twitter, Radio Detectives. Check us out on Instagram, instagram.com/greatdetectives. From Boise, Idaho, this is your host, Adam Graham, signing off.